Good morning to you all. Let me start with a topical and local quotation. I'm going to defy the camera over there and get in the middle of you and get a bit nearer too. Is that all right? I don't like to be dominated by being placed. This is from Alice McKeough of Maidstone, and she recorded in her Memoirs of Maidstone, written in 1987. She said, "During the Great War, I remember seeing a black man for the first time. He was in the army and billeted in Allen Street. He used to talk to all the children and was so nice." Now, I wonder who he was and where he came from and which unit he was with. Over to you, who live in Maidstone and who are interested in these things, to do some research for me, please. Now, let's come to the title of our breaking of the myths, and I'm looking for a clock because I'm a good timekeeper and I can't see one. So, right, and I'm early. Breaking the myths that we've gathered to consider. Now, who makes myths? How do they originate? How are they perpetuated? And are they actually myths? Now, I do have a sneaking feeling when I see the word myths that behind it is the idea of a conspiracy of some sort, that someone out there doesn't want us to know about the past, which they contrive to either ignore, hide, or misinform. There are other projects with similar titles. One that I'm involved with, and which was mentioned just now, is Hidden Histories of the Great War. I sometimes wonder, what is being hidden? Hidden implies a positive and direct action. I know what it means. It means that as a project we're encouraging people to do research on, say, Belgian refugees in Britain. Aliens who had their shops burnt and destroyed by angry British hooligans and mobs. Of people who are displaced, of those who were marginalised in the story of the war, who were sick and broken by the terrible experiences they had endured. And it's also about black people in the British Army and black people who were conscripted or enlisted in the colonial armies and fought either in Europe, that could be French, or particularly in Africa itself. But what is being hidden, and from whom? And if so, how and why? I think we need to ask questions about things that we're addressing. Then there is David Olusoga's splendid recent book on Black and British, which his subtitle is A Forgotten Story. Forgotten by whom? I often look at it, I've been reviewing it at the moment. It's a title that I would wish to amend, although it would make it clumsy, by adding "and the undiscovered story." In that historians are constantly involved in research and writing about the presence of black people in Britain, and are steadily providing a larger body of knowledge and analysis to aid our understanding of that essential part of Britain's history. Perhaps the myth element is due to a general lack of popular curiosity about the past, or a lack of knowledge, or perhaps even confidence on the part of people as to how to actually engage with it. How, if you like, to find out where it is and to discover it. The nuts and bolts that are essential for anything that we inquire into. I wonder also if many people in Britain assemble piecemeal their own story of the past. They mentally write it, and it's one that they think is not only true, but with which they are comfortable. The recent Brexit vote might well indicate that. So I've listened to people being interviewed. or those in the United States on this disastrous, tragic day, more or less now, who turned out to vote for Trump. I mean, listen to those people, and they have written their own history. It's a bit like religion, actually. Large numbers of people write their own religion because those are the circumstances that fit in with their own lives and they're comfortable with. It's fascinating stuff, actually. Now, with regard to Africa's contribution to the First World War, does the myth suggest that there was an official silence about it? There's little evidence, given the large number of contemporary books and articles that appeared, and of course the steady flow of novels and films about Africa in the First World War. But nevertheless, it is true that accounts were overwhelmingly Eurocentric, and that there were few accounts written by Africans. Most of those people who were enlisted, whether they were French, for the Portuguese, for the British, for the Germans, were non-literate. And therefore, they were not able to pass on their story except orally, which they probably did at great length round fires in the evening to bore their neighbours, who says, "There's old Joma, he's going on again about his bit in the war." Or perhaps they just kept silent because it was such a searing experience. Certainly the question of the significance of imperial and African contributions to the war has not been given the prominence that some think it deserves. Certainly African civilian suffering in the Great War has been overlooked, although not, I may add, by historians of Africa, of which I'm one. So there might be a popular lack of knowledge of this, but that does not imply that the stuff has not been written about and is currently being written about, and there's great curiosity about it. And here there is a dilemma, because I think it's only the exceptional historian, almost the novelist historian, who can describe the pitch of pain wrought by war. There are very few books even on war in Europe that engage with that, because it is such a difficult subject to get at. And for those who think of the Great War solely as a military conflict, then the wars fought in Africa, which were very similar in form to the colonial wars of a previous decade or two, were overshadowed by the vast and costly battles fought in the European theatres. The African wars were sideshows, and that is dictated by the weight of significance, the numbers of people involved, and so on. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't study it and that we shouldn't bring it into line with what we know about the Great War to widen our understanding. But now I want to come to three issues which I wish to emphasize. First of all, the Great War was a total war, a world war. In Britain, by the evidence of the books published in the last few years and sentiments that I have heard expressed in a life of teaching at various levels, it's generally seen as a British war on the Western Front. I did a quick survey at various times from 2012, 13 and 14 of the books that were in my local booksellers, coming up to the outbreak of the war in 1914. Most of them were on the Western Front. Very, very few addressed other parts of the world. The major conflicts in Eastern Europe were even ignored, in the Caucasus, on the Eastern Front, northern Italy, Mesopotamia, or for that matter, Africa itself. It was also a war between imperial powers. That is why Africa is actually dragged into the war. Germany, France, Russia, the Ottomans, Italy, Belgium, Portugal, Japan, The United States and Britain, supported by the white-dominated dominions, most with their own sub-imperial ambitions, were all imperial states of one kind or another. Some with contiguous empires such as Russia and of course Austria-Hungary. And Germany, they proclaim themselves as empires. Whereas British Empire was a sort of hang-on to the British bit. The French thought slightly more grandly about it as an overseas empire that somehow could be assimilated, integrated with France. We never thought like that in Britain. After all, in 1914, the first African is elected to the French Legislative Assembly. And there are people who are writing at the beginning of the 20th century who say it would be a good idea if there was colonial representation, and particularly black people, in Westminster. And that has never come about at all. Whereas France, certainly up to the 1970s, if not beyond, did have its overseas territories, and it still does with the overseas territories which are very different from our own overseas territories. In the process, overseas colonial territories and the peoples in them were drawn into the war. And the war was fought on several continents, on the high seas, and across the major rivers of the world. And it employed modern industrial technology to kill on a vast scale, with the deployment of new weapons such as submarines, aircraft, and tanks. And also the prosecution of the war involved the total mobilization of resources, human and material, both at home as well as in the empire. So it's not as if the empire is necessarily being treated more harshly, although there are instances where there is certainly neglect and it is more harsh. Okay, so it's a global war. Let me come to my second point, and that is about periodization. We often talk about the 1914-18 war. Britain's Victory Medal, and I have my grandfather's one, and it's inscribed on the reverse as the Great War for Civilization, 1914 to 19. Now that begs all sorts of questions, doesn't it? Which civilization were the inscribers thinking of? The one that they had lost, or the one that they thought they had gained? And how would you know what you'd gained doing it in 1918, about years that had not yet come? But the periodization of the war, and do remember that's all that's talking about is the actual conflict, and wars are never like that. They not only have long run-ins, but they also have long tails. And the consequences of war, which is part of the war itself, is not merely the conflict of arms, as bitter and as bloody and brutal and muddy as it all was. So, if you're an Ottoman, a Turk, you see the Great War in terms of not that periodization, but 1911, when Libya was contested with Italy, part of the war, right through to the Treaty of Lausanne, which settled modern Turkish state, 1923. Or for the Italians, was it 1915 to 18? But surely Mussolini coming to power in 22 and then securing his fascist grip on Italy is a consequence of the war. You can't separate it from the war. And at the human level, there is a long tale of suffering and grief, of cities destroyed, economies disrupted, lives broken, political turmoil and cultural dissonance. And it's incumbent on historians, I think, not to forget the religious responses of the war. Perhaps the loss of faith in Europe, but the finding of faith within Africa, particularly in East and Central Africa, where the combined impact of famine, war, and disease including the flu pandemic of 1918 to 19, which kills 4.4 to 6% of the population of that region of Africa. Now, for people who experience this flu pandemic, which came and then went, came from where? No one knew. Went, where did it go? But it killed. Not everybody, but it killed a large number. And for those people, there was what one historian has called a crisis of comprehension, which turned people to old and new religious affiliations and movements. We have not been faithful to the old gods, to our traditional ways. We have allowed the Europeans to tread on us in a way that we should not have allowed. We have abandoned the truths of Christianity. We have forgotten Islam, and we must return to it. That's a very important aspect, and it's one that historians of Africa have worked on. And it's there and it's available for people to read. But there are also the pervasive economic tentacles of war. Wartime inflation, for example, touches every part of the globe. There is no part of the world that is insecure from it, belligerent or neutral. And in the turmoil of war, defeat, and collapsed empires, including in Europe and Asia, new wars continued or broke out in Ireland, across much of Eastern Europe, the bloody lands of contestation, as one historian has called it, between Greece and Turkey, and also in colonial or semi-imperial possessions such as Egypt and India. Perhaps the final periodization of the Great War is somewhere in the mid-1920s. I did give a paper on this a short time ago, and I put the title as The Great War 1911 to 1926 ? Or perhaps we cannot decide when the impact ceased. A.J.P. Taylor famously described the period of 20 years between the end of the military conflict in Europe and the beginning of the military conflict in 1939 as being an interlude, a break, orange sucking time, if you like, before the next round. And then there's a third question that I want to stress. This was a war unlike few previous wars, in that there was this large-scale mobilization of civilians for the war effort, systematically done, both at home and overseas. And that included not only the home front, I don't know what the figure is, I can't remember, it's an aging problem, mainly about names, but also even statistics once fondly known and coveted. But is it 5 or 6 men and women to keep one soldier in the front? Something like that. And the ratio is changing and growing. So by the Second World War, it's something like 10 or 15 people in the manufacturing process to keep a soldier at the front and to keep them equipped and fed and armed. And more has been written about the contribution of wartime labour. And that labour comes from contiguous empires. For example, Russia drew on peoples in Central and Eastern Asia for their labour force, and from the Caucasus. The British drew on people in the African continent, some of whom are brought to Europe, the South African Native Labour Corps, for example, or Egyptians brought by the British to the Western Front, or even from neutral countries like China. And here you've got China and Egypt as being good examples, perhaps, of people who were prepared to, for commercial and political reasons, allow the recruitment of large numbers of local people for use outside of the country. In the case of Egypt, the Sinai campaign is supported by about 300,000 fellaheen who labour to not only carry goods up to the front against the Turks, but also to build the defensive system. They fed my grandfather. They carried his goods as he fought as a private soldier in the First World War against the Ottomans. And in addition, there were large numbers of African soldiers that were recruited in the African colonial empires, particularly by the French, who employed not only Africans, but also people from Indonesia and Madagascar in regiments that were frontline regiments on the Western Front. South Africans allowed the British to recruit the South African Native Labour Corps and to bring it to Europe. So finally, how do we, in 2017, view and manage the events that took place in Africa 100 years ago? Sure, there are memorials, any of them erected shortly after the war in African colonial capitals: Dakar, Accra, Dar es Salaam. Spent many happy moments around the war memorial in Dar es Salaam, sitting in, or rather usually avoiding the sun, but actually enjoying the centre of the city, small city then, 50 years ago, and in Nairobi and in Kampala and so on. But there are also new memorials. The Queen, when she visited South Africa after 1994, laid a memorial on the Mendi Memorial in Soweto. The Mendi was a ship that was carrying African troops of the South African Native Labour Corps across to Europe in a foggy February, and it was struck by another ship, and 617 men went down. There is some writing by Africans about that. But it's the only time that the white-dominated, racist you could say, South African Parliament stood to remember black people. And thereafter, Mendi Day was an important commemorative day about the war. So it lived on in the popular imagination of many South Africans who were black or coloured. But perhaps we need another Mendi memorial, one not far from the Needles, the nearest point of British land to which where the ship sank. And every time I get an opportunity to talk about it, I do, like now, so that I hope that I influence someone to say later on, we need a memorial for the Mendi on the Isle of Wight. And what about our individual roles as we view from 100 years on? Maybe it is to spur us to learn more about this part of our own history, to research assiduously, write sensitively and accurately on the role and sufferings of Africans who got caught up in a war that was not their own. And perhaps also another thing that we can do individually and collectively is to press the shapers of the modern curriculum in our schools to make sure that they do include in the history lessons that youngsters are taught a balanced history of the war that does give Africa a place. Thank you.